In this episode, we will look at aspects of Joan Lindsay's literary style in Picnic at Hanging Rock. We'll begin by clarifying what is meant by literary style, before focusing directly on the various Gothic elements in the novel. All quotations are from the 2019 reprint by Text Publishing Melbourne. In literature, the distinct feel of any text is created by a number of integral elements and the ways in which an author exploits them. Here is a list of 9 points which will help us to explore the text at a more technical level. 1. Form. 2. Genre. 3. Structure. 4. Expository technique. 5. Point of view, authorial perspective. 6. Diction, voice, narrative technique, vocabulary. 7. Syntax. 8. Symbolism, imagery. And 9. Character delineation. Picnic at Hanging Rock is a novel which, despite all of the conjecture about whether or not the events actually happened, we will regard for our purposes as fiction. The genre of the novel has been variously described, but most views seem to centre on it as either a Gothic novel or a coming-of-age novel, what can also be referred to technically as a Bildungsroman, using the German term which has been imported into English. Some scholars regard the novel as a mixed genre work. Wikipedia even describes it as historical fiction, framed as though it is a true story and corroborated by ambiguous pseudo-historical references. Still other critics have classified it as a horror story. At times then, the question of genre can become a little involved and contentious. In part 2 of this episode, I will outline my understanding of the text as a Gothic novel, although I accept that there is some good reasoning for seeing it as belonging to other literary genres. This novel is structured conventionally around 17 chapters. These proceed in a linear fashion across a core period of several weeks. Sometimes the word exposition is used incorrectly as a synonym for plot. Let me clarify the difference. If I ask for the plot of a novel, I am basically requesting a summary of the storyline involving key events and characters. If I ask about a novel's exposition, however, I am inquiring about an actual rhetorical process within the text. Here is a definition I often use for the word exposition in a literary context. The strategic process of revealing and concealing information within a text. This is very important for students of literature because it deals with the how of the text and therefore opens up the possibility of incisive analysis. Plot, which deals with the that of the text, is important only insofar as it leads to or points to real analysis of the workings of the text. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, Lindsay's expository technique depends very much on us not knowing, and in fact never knowing for sure exactly what happened to the missing girls, while all the time suggesting or intimating explanations which remain unresolved. Authorial perspective is often referred to in terms of the writer's views and values. The process of interpreting any text lies in posing 2 key questions. What does the writer believe? And what was the writer's world? We know, for example, that Joan Lindsay's schooling occurred in a context very similar to that depicted in the novel. We also know that she was fascinated by the concept of time and its role in our perception of reality. From an interview before, we know too that she wanted to show how the consequences of a catalyzing event, such as the girl's disappearance, can have an ongoing ripple effect on the lives of people who are not directly connected to these events, such as Reg Lumley, for example, the brother of Dora Lumley.
Yeah, I've been terribly interested in time, always. I always felt that it was something that was all-round one, not just in a long line in a calendar. I feel it's that one's in the middle of time, and the past, present and future is really all-round, and I'm in the middle of it, which is a very unscientific way of describing it.
Words are to the writer as clay is to the sculptor. They are the very building blocks of all language. How a writer assembles them and exploits their expressive potential is very much at the heart of their craft. Narrative voice results from a particular manipulation of the mechanics of language, which include vocabulary, punctuation, and syntax. These are all aspects of what we call the writer's diction. Lindsay's vocabulary is rich, diverse, and descriptive, even poetic in certain passages. Consider this line, for example, from page 49. The scent of stocks and sun-drenched petunias was overpowering on the windless air. We can hear the sibilance in, quote, scent of stocks and sun-drenched petunias, unquote, which gives the language a more literary and poetic tonality. Lindsay draws on a sophisticated vocabulary with a high frequency of polysyllabic words, many of which are derived from Latin. Her syntax occasionally sounds quite dated to capture the period in which the novel is set, and to help create certain characters such as Mrs. Appleyard, whose speech is very formal and British. The fundamental issue of which words are selected largely determines a writer's diction. And this gives the writer a certain type of voice and therefore a personality as well. Diction can be formal, informal, colloquial, or may even involve slang. Picture at Hanging Rock has an omniscient narrator who is not involved directly in the action as a named character, but who usually speaks to us in a formal register. While this narrator is basically our storyteller, there are other modes in which this same narrator can speak to us. Several times in Picnic at Hanging Rock, the omniscient narrator provides our questioning, while at the same time entering the minds of certain characters. An ambiguity results, which is at the core of the technique known as free indirect discourse. I have explored this technique in episode 1, but have saved one of the best examples for our current discussion. On page 36, we read, confronted by such monumental configurations of nature, the human eye is woefully inadequate. Who can say how many or how few of its unfolding marvels are actually seen, selected, and recorded by the 4 pairs of eyes now fixed in staring wonder at the Hanging Rock? Does Marion Quaid note the horizontal ledges crisscrossing the verticals of the main pattern, whose geological formation must be memorized for next Monday's essay? Is Edith aware of the hundreds of frail star-like flowers crushed under her trampling boots, while Irma catches the scarlet flash of a parrot's wing and thinks it aflame amongst the leaves? And Miranda, whose feet appear to be choosing their own way through the ferns as she tilts her head towards the glittering peaks, does she already feel herself more than a spectator agape at a holiday pantomime? So they walk silently towards the lower slopes, in single file, each locked in the private world of her own perceptions, unconscious of the strains and tensions of the molten mass that hold it anchored to the groaning earth, of the creakings and shudderings, the wandering airs and currents known only to the wise little bats hanging upside down in its clammy caves. None of them see or hear the snake dragging its copper coils over the stones ahead, nor the panic exodus of spiders, grubs, and woodlice from rotting leaves and bark. There are no tracks on this part of the rock, or if there ever have been tracks, they are long since obliterated. It is a long time since any living creature, other than an occasional rabbit or wallaby, trespassed upon its arid breast. This is a long passage, so let's break it down into its basic components. Essentially, Lindsay is doing 4 main things here at a technical level. First, she is describing the outstanding features of the rock and creating mystery around it. Second, she is taking us into the minds of the girls as they process the extraordinary environment they are entering. Third, she is distinguishing the girls from each other by their different questions, observations, and movements, thereby adding to the characterization in her novel. And fourth, she is moving her narrative forward by drawing the girls towards the slopes of the rock where the novel's pivotal event will occur. Notice the sustained use of the questions. Our narrator is omniscient or all-knowing, so he or she doesn't need to learn anything new about the world of the novel. The questions then become a kind of dialogue with us, in which the narrator is saying the equivalent of, "I bet you'd like to know what the girls are really thinking," or "You, reader, should be interested in what's going on for each of these girls." Something dramatic. We notice too a number of language features which indicate that our narrator wishes to draw us into the strangeness of the girls' experiences. They walk, quote, "silently towards the lower slopes," unquote. Silence hasn't been a characteristic of the girls' ebullient behaviour up to this point. The narrator then tells us that they were, quote, "unconscious of the strains and tensions of the molten mass that hold it anchored to the groaning earth," unquote. I think the word unconscious operates significantly here as a danger signal or warning, which suggests that the girls' lack of awareness will make them vulnerable to the knowingness or prescience of the rock. So what's particularly interesting here is that in a mysterious way, the omniscient or all-knowing narrator is in a kind of partnership with the omniscient rock and now wants to draw us more directly into the inescapability of the girl's situation. Just as a further point of analysis, notice too that the questions are in the present tense and therefore invite us more directly into the moment each girl is experiencing. Another aspect of style which can also influence how we hear the voice of the narrator is syntax or word order. So it has a lot to do with grammatical construction. Clearly, Lindsay follows the rules of English grammar consistently, although her punctuation is idiosyncratic overall. But there are several characteristic patterns in her writing which are worth noting. She likes, for example, to interpolate a modifying clause or phrase immediately after announcing the subject of the sentence. Mrs. Appleyard, although the arrangement smacked vaguely of frivolity, could hardly object. Sometimes there will be multiple modifying clauses, as in the following examples where the verb in the clause is understood. Mrs. Appleyard, playing patience in her study, with one ear cocked for the sound of the drag coming up the gravel drive, decided to ask Mr. Hussey to step inside for a glass of brandy. The headmistress, aware of Edith's limited intelligence and unlimited obstinacy, plus a possible mild concussion, thought the expedition a waste of time and said so to Bumfer, who bluntly disagreed. When writers use symbols to express or explore ideas and qualities, they exploit the power of the symbol to speak beyond its literal sense, and often in more profound and thought-provoking ways. Symbols that are used recurringly become motifs. My previous two episodes deal directly with key aspects of the novel's symbolism, as it is developed through the swan motif and the very rock itself, so I won't spend time on these now. There are other symbolic elements in the text though, and these include the landscape and the mansion which has become Appleyard College. The narrator describes this building on page 6 as, quote, "an architectural anachronism," unquote, and, quote, "a hopeless misfit in time and place," unquote. Imagery, like symbolism, calls into play the reader's imagination and capacity to think abstractly. It consists of descriptive language that is intended to function as a way for the reader to better imagine aspects of the world created by the writer. It invites the reader to see with the mind's eye, but it also draws on the 5 senses: taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound. The novel is full of examples of multi-sensory experiences. When Mike is recovering in his sick room, for instance, we are told on page 123 that, quote, Sometimes he was conscious of the smell of disinfectant, sometimes of a drift of flowery scent from the garden." Unquote. Literary works are inhabited by characters who are usually people, but can sometimes also be animals or objects or even ideas. In episode 2, for example, I suggested that in Picnic at Hanging Rock, the so-called monolith seems to function at times as a key character. Writers usually employ two ways of delineating their characters. Either in the first instance by telling us directly what they are like through narrative description, or in the second instance by letting us observe them in order to make judgments about them when they speak or act. Certain writers, such as the American author Ernest Hemingway, wrote in a very minimalist style in order that the reader would have to participate more actively than usual in filling in the missing details of the text. Lindsay, though, is generally more conventional in the method she employs. Let's listen to her description of Mrs. Appleyard as she introduces her to the reader on page 8. Whether the headmistress of Appleyard College, as the local white elephant was at once rechristened in gold lettering on a handsome board at the big iron gates, had any previous experience in the educational field was never divulged. It was unnecessary. With her high-piled, greying pompadour and ample bosom, as rigidly controlled and disciplined as her private ambitions, the cameo portrait of her late husband flat on her respectable chest, the stately stranger looked precisely what the parents expected of an English headmistress. And as looking the part is well known to be more than half the battle in any form of business enterprise, from Punch and Judy to floating alone on the stock exchange, the college from the very first day was a success, and by the end of the first year, showing a gratifying profit. Here, the narrator does the descriptive work for us. Mademoiselle de Poitiers and Greta Macraw are introduced to us in a similarly direct manner. Think, however, of the way in which Miranda's character is sketched out for us in a much more extended and fragmentary way. Miranda is a mysterious and ethereal persona, and the glimpses we are given of her never coalesce into a sharply defined picture. It is not until page 28 describe Miranda as a, quote, Botticelli angel from the Uffizi, unquote. We examined earlier in this episode the long passage from page 36 in which the narrator poses a variety of questions which are attached to certain qualities possessed by each girl. This is a more subtle and unconventional way of providing us with insights into their character traits. Think about this proposition, that Lindsay describes her adult characters directly and conventionally, while she creates mystery around the girls by describing them in a more fragmentary way. Now, in the second part of episode 3, let's examine the novel as an example of the Gothic genre, and specifically of the Australian Gothic genre. To start with, we have to be aware that the term Gothic remains notoriously difficult to define. In the late 18th century, Gothic literature emerged as one of the earliest forms of what is called dark romanticism, a literary genre that developed as part of the larger Romantic movement. It's characterized by terror, gruesome narratives, supernatural elements, and dark, picturesque scenery. We will outline shortly a more definitive set of criteria relevant to Picnic at Hanging Rock, but it's worth noting that from the late 1700s to the present, Gothic fiction has undergone several revivals, thanks to certain writers who have revisited the genre or taken it in a new direction. Some texts incorporate a Gothic element along with other generic forms and may therefore be termed hybrid. The list of famous writers who have exploited the Gothic genre in their writing is very long, but it includes Horace Walpole, Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, the Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens, and Oscar Wilde. As I mentioned earlier, some scholars regard Picnic at Hanging Rock as possessing a hybrid genre. The uniquely Australian tradition of Gothic fiction has traditionally been one of textual hybrids, which has seen Imperial Gothic and postcolonial Gothic traditions develop, and in more recent times, Aboriginal Gothic as well. Picnic at Hanging Rock fits quite neatly into the Australian post-colonial Gothic genre, which focuses on the colonised subject and highlights the racist behaviour of the colonisers, while simultaneously educating readers on the religio-cultural traditions of the indigenous population, or of the landscape. Picnic at Hanging Rock utilises Gothic tropes, such as mysterious landscapes, and the unusual reaction to them of white Anglo-Australians, in order to explore both the perspective of the colonised subject as well as the settlers' fears regarding the otherness and mystery of the land. It's important to remember that the landscape of Australia was a source of anxiety for the early British settlers. The vastness of the country and the uninhabitableness of much of it stood in stark contrast to the urban density of industrial England. Even the idea of travelling for hours across an apparently empty, repetitive landscape and moving deeper into the heart of the unknown is recognisable as a typical Gothic trope. Certain scholars have observed that the imperialists of the 19th century were unavoidably violators of the natural world and its rightful inhabitants. To help us explore the Gothic nature of Picnic at Hanging Rock, we'll use the following list of headings: mystery and fear, atmosphere and setting, conflicting historical or time periods, the supernatural, miraculous and paranormal, dreams and nightmares, the virginal maiden, romance, the anti-hero, and villains. Gothic narratives strive to evoke a sense of fear, to create an environment of mystery, and to provide an experience of horror. Anything that is beyond scientific explanation belongs to the realm of the unknown and can open the way to such experiences. Some of the methods Lindsay uses to imbue her novel with mystery and fear will become obvious as we move shortly to an analysis of specific Gothic elements. At the heart of Picnic of Hanging Rock, though, is the naggingly unresolved disappearance of the two girls who never returned from the rock, and for whose disappearance there seem to be only inadequate explanations and various bizarre theories. This unsettling and disturbing mystery raises the fearful possibility that a force beyond human understanding and control, most likely sinister in its intent, has claimed the girls for itself. Fear, of course, can elicit melodramatic responses, or what is sometimes referred to in Gothic fiction as high emotion. This reaches the heights of unbridled hysteria several times in the novel, most notably when Irma visits the girls in the gymnasium. Someone knocks over a wooden stool and Edith screams out loud. Mademoiselle, recognizing the hyena call of hysteria, walks calmly to the edge of the dais with madly thumping heart. Edith, stop that horrible noise! Blanche, Juliana, be silent! All of you be silent! Too late. The light voice of authority goes unheard as the smouldering passion, long banked down under the weight of grey disciplines and secret fears, bursts into flames. The novel revolves around two key settings: the Rock and Appleyard College. Episode 2 deals at length with the nature and significance of the Rock, so at this point we will focus mainly on the mansion. Gothic writers set the tone of their novels by choosing evocative and atmospheric physical locations, which contribute directly to the fear and dread they seek to elicit. Settings often include dark forests, dangerous mountain regions, ominous climatic conditions, imposing or sinister buildings such as castles or mansions, and places of death such as graveyards or morgues. As well as depicting the Australian bush and landscape, Lindsay also describes English buildings and the grounds which surround them, almost as if they are also characters in her novel. In her opening paragraph, the author describes the external view of the college as follows. A shimmering summer morning, warm and still, with cicadas shrilling all through breakfast from the loquat trees outside the dining room windows, and bees murmuring above the pansies bordering the drive. Heavy-headed dahlias flamed and drooped in the immaculate flower beds. The well-trimmed lawns steamed under the mounting sun. The intention here is to set up a dramatic contrast with the details of the rock and its environs. Despite the manicured beauty of the gardens, they are completely out of place when contrasted with the Australian bush. In a much later scene, the two worlds overlap and collide in horrific fashion when Irma visits her fellow students in the gymnasium, a scene we have already visited. They experience a terrifying mass hallucination of the rock, while grouped together within the confines of the man-made building. "Oh, Miranda, Marion, where have you gone? The shadow of the rock has grown darker and longer. They sit rooted to the ground and cannot move. The dreadful shape is a living monster lumbering towards them across the plain, scattering rocks and boulders. So near now, they can see the cracks and hollows where the lost girls lie rotting in a filthy cave." The ghostliness of the mansion is emphasized in the final chapters of the novel, as Mrs. Appleyard's world continues to fall apart and her psychological trauma increases. The clock on the stairs had just struck for 12:30 when the door of Mrs. Appleyard's room opened noiselessly, inch by inch, and an old woman carrying a nightlight came out onto the landing. An old woman with head bowed under a forest of curling pins, with pendulous breasts and sagging stomach beneath a flannel dressing gown. No human being, not even Arthur, had ever seen her thus, without the battle dress of steel and whalebone in which for 18 hours a day the headmistress was accustomed to face the world. From the window at the top of the staircase, moonlight fell upon the row of closed cedar doors. Mademoiselle slept at the far end of the corridor, Miss Buck in a small room at the rear of the tower. The woman with the nightlight stood listening to the tick-tock, tick-tock, coming up out of the shadows below. This passage contains an abundance of traditional Gothic elements. The scene is at night. We have passed midnight, which is often regarded as the supernatural hour. Mrs. Appleyard has been transformed into an old woman. Her battle dress is gone and she is now vulnerable to the world. Moonlight falls upon closed doors. Others are locked in their rooms. The clock ticks away the seconds of her life, and the ticking emerges out of the shadows. On page 246, we learn that, quote, "The college itself was totally destroyed by a bushfire during the following summer," unquote. With its annihilation, the imperial intruder, the illegitimate colonizer, has been vanquished. What remains is what has always been, and the colonized subject is freed from the tyranny of foreign domination. The building designed to, quote, "withstand the ravages of time," unquote, has yielded to the power of the environment in the same way that the artificiality of Englishness has succumbed to the integrity of indigeneity. In the same way that places, buildings and locales are often used to amplify the Gothic nature of a text, so too can a conflict between historical or time periods underline a sense of mystery and fear. Gothic narratives often take place at moments of transition when the temporal order becomes contested. There can be a strong opposition between the modern or the New World order and the ancient or archaic. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, just such a conflict occurs between the rock as colonial presence and Appleyard College as post-colonial intruder. Mr. Hussey refers to the rock as being millions of years old, while the narrator describes the Italianate mansion as an architectural anachronism. The two zones represent a struggle between the eternal and the transient or temporal. In the end, as in many a Gothic tale, the pre-existing order exacts revenge over the new order and expels or obliterates it. Joan Lindsay's story is no different in its post-colonial agenda. That which comes after is illegitimate and unsustainable. The timeless land will always emerge victorious. the mansion and its inhabitants must ultimately be vanquished. In Gothic fiction, supernatural, miraculous and paranormal activity often contributes to undermining our sense of security and predictability in the routines and realities of waking consciousness. Think of the unsettling effect of the two watches stopping simultaneously at midday when the party is picnicking at the Rock. There seems to be a kind of time warp at the Rock which defies the laws of physics. The Rock itself broods over the whole narrative as if it has an intelligence and intentionality all of its own. Its powerful influence extends far beyond its geographical location. Irma Leopold miraculously survives on the Rock for several days, her body, quote, unblemished and virginal, unquote, with, quote, no broken bones and only a few minor cuts and bruises on the face and hands, unquote. Dr. Mackenzie, consulting with Dr. Cooling, marvels at Irma's condition. Quote, it's a miracle. By all ordinary textbook standards, the patient should have been dead long ago. Unquote. Joan Lindsay is reputed to have been interested in spiritualism, which is the belief that the spirits of the dead not only exist, but have the ability and the desire to communicate with the living. Her depiction of the Miranda Swan certainly captures this belief. Various characters experience strange dreams. The girls give way to hysteria, and their headmistress takes her own life. Added to this is the description in chapter 15 of the moon, an astronomical body commonly associated with insanity. Mademoiselle de Poitiers finds herself at this stage unable to sleep, and her mind is plagued with questioning and doubt. When she leaned out over the sill, she could see the sleepy pitched slate roof shining under the moon, and beyond it the squat little tower, black against the sky. Could it be true that the moon actually had something to do with the thoughts and even the actions of human beings millions of miles below on the earth? She could feel the tide of silver light flowing over her sensitive skin. Not only her mind, but her whole being was preternaturally awake and aware. While some characters struggle with sleep, others are prey to strange and disturbing dreams. For some time now, dreams have often been understood as manifestations of the subconscious or the supernatural. This, of course, makes them very useful in Gothic fiction. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, the word dream occurs 29 times and the word nightmare 11 times. Several of the protagonists experience dreaming, including Mrs. Appleyard, whose chapter 4 dream we look at a little later in the section which deals with the Antihero. Others include Michael Fitzhubert and Albert Crundle. I have already dealt in episode 1 with Michael's dream involving the Miranda Swan, so for the purposes of underlining the Gothic elements in how dreams are presented in the novel, I'll draw on Albert Crundle's first dream, which occurs in chapter 8. His second, concerning his kid sister, occurs in chapter 14. At Michael's insistence, he and Albert have revisited the Rock in search of the girls, but after failing to find them, Michael has insisted on remaining overnight at the Rock, while Albert reluctantly returns to Colonel Fitzhubert's estate. His troubled and restless state leads to a telling dream. Although he normally fell into instant dreamless sleep the moment his head touched the pillow, Albert passed the rest of the night in a succession of disturbing dreams in which the voice of Michael kept calling for him from regions always inaccessible. Sometimes it came drifting in through the tiny window from the lake, sometimes in moaning gusts from the avenue, sometimes almost beside him, close to his ear. "Albert, where are you? Albert!" So that he actually sat up in bed, sweating and wide awake. For once it was a positive relief when the sun rose, filling his little box of a room with orange light, and it was time to get up, put his head under the pump, and see to the horses. The world of the Gothic is characteristically a place of the unusual. Albert normally experiences dreamless sleep, but on this occasion he experiences a succession of dreams that are disturbing. When he hears Michael's voice, it is calling for help, quote, from regions inaccessible, unquote, suggesting somewhere supernatural that is unavailable to mere mortals. The voice is multispatial, drifting and moaning in the distance and then sounding close to Albert's ear. The dream becomes a nightmare in which Albert is powerless to help Michael, who repeatedly calls him by name. Albert's reaction is a physical one, as he sits up in bed, quote, sweating and wide awake, unquote. Lindsay's use of such dreams serves to underline the novel's Gothic tonality, while at the same time allowing us to understand more about Albert's character and his relationship with Michael. In Gothic literature, there is a strong link between youthful virginity and beauty and purity. The virginal maiden is innocent, unblemished, virtuous, and sensitive. She represents vulnerability, especially to men and their dark patriarchal world. Two examples are Matilda in Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto and Adeline in Anne Radcliffe's The Romance of the Forest. Young virgins also become ideal sacrifices to malevolent male figures, such as gods, high priests, or monarchs. The girls of Appleyard College fit this convention very readily. They are on the verge of sexual maturity. They are absorbed by the romantic associations with St. Valentine's Day, and the seclusion afforded by their boarding school experience helps to keep them uncontaminated by the wider adult world. Their adolescent attraction to each other further frees them from the heteronormative hegemony of their society. Lindsay's description of Irma and of her relationship with Miranda encompasses many of these conventions. Radiantly lovely at 17, the little heiress was without personal vanity or pride of possession. She loved people and things to be beautiful, and pinned a bunch of wildflowers into her coat with as much pleasure as a breathtaking diamond brooch. Sometimes just to look at Miranda's calm oval face and straight corn yellow hair gave her a sharp little stab of pleasure. Darling Miranda, now gazing dreamily out at the sunlit garden. Miranda, as we know, is described as a Botticelli angel, a description which suggests a kind of aesthetic and ethereal asexuality. She, along with Irma and Marion Quaid, will become the three virgins sacrificed to the rock. While Irma is mysteriously released from the hold of the rock, Miranda and Marion remain forever lost to it. The narrator gives us a description of Marion early in the novel, which underlines her intellectual and physical asexuality. Reputed to have mastered long division in the cradle, Marion Quaid had spent the greater part of her 17 years in the restless pursuit of knowledge. Small wonder that with her thin, intelligent features, sensitive nose that appeared to be always on the scent of something long awaited and sought, and thin, swift legs, she had come to resemble a greyhound. Miranda and Marion are the two virgins whom the sentient rock chooses for its victims, and whose disappearance brings to all the other girls a nightmare world, which the narrator describes in chapter 5 as, quote, half dream, half reality, unquote. The earliest Gothic literature grew out of the conventions of Romantic literature, so it comes as no surprise that the two genres overlap. Numerous Gothic novels feature wild and passionate romances, which generally end badly, often tragically. Whilst the girls in Picnic at Hanging Rock readily participate in naive rituals around romance, they do not become involved in any seriously conventional relationships within the novel. Mademoiselle de Poitiers marries, but this part of the plotline is outside our discussion of the Gothic elements in the novel. For a brief period, Irma, having been rescued from the rock and cared for by the Fitzhuberts, becomes infatuated with Michael. He does not reciprocate her affection, but writes a devastatingly blunt letter to her, announcing his intentions to head north to Queensland. At the end of chapter 12, we learn that in the same magnetic moment by the creek, which drew Michael forever to Miranda, Irma herself was drawn mysteriously to Michael. Again she sees the flash of the creek, the wagonette under the blackwood trees, and a fair-haired young man sitting on the grass reading a newspaper. As soon as she sees him, she turns her head away and doesn't look at him again. Why? 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 Screeches the peacock on the lawn. Because I knew, even then, I have always known, that Mike is my beloved. Mike, in fact, is the closest in the novel to a romantic obsessive. He is in an impossible relationship with his memory of the Miranda he aspired once only in the flesh, for a matter of seconds, when she and the 3 other expeditionary girls passed the spot where he was talking with Albert, on their way up the rock. Episode 1 of this series explores in detail the swan motif, which Lindsay uses as the means of developing an unusual romantic thread in her novel. For Michael, the Miranda swan's ghostly manifestations take on a kind of reality from which he is unable to free himself. The relationship becomes a key element in the novel's Gothic identity. Let's talk now about the concept of the anti-hero. In Gothic fiction, the protagonist often takes the form of an anti-hero, a flawed character with dark and even monstrous qualities. They are often powerful figures who hold high social rank and who are physically imposing as well. Often their personalities are extreme in some way or another. They are psychologically fixated, susceptible to various abuses including alcohol, and carry a personal loss or burden. They are doomed from the start to suffer the consequences of their flaws, limitations, and neuroses. You can see, I'm sure, how well Mrs. Appleyard fits this description. In Chapter 1, as we have already seen, there are several passages in which the character of Mrs. Appleyard is established for us with extraordinary detail and impact, almost as if she is a kind of Dickensian grotesque. On page 13, she appears on the veranda before delivering her warning to the girls about the dangers of the rock. Now an immense purposeful figure was swimming and billowing in grey silk taffeta onto the tiled and colonnaded veranda, like a galleon in full sail. On the gently heaving bosom, a cameo portrait of a gentleman in side whiskers, framed in garnets and gold, rose and fell in tune with the pumping of the powerful lungs, encased in a fortress of steel busks and a stiff grey calico. "Good morning, girls," boomed the gracious plummy voice, specially imported from Kensington. Notice how words such as immense, galleon, steel, and fortress all reinforce how powerful and forbidding this figure is. The cameo portrait, too, is a highly significant detail which has already been mentioned on page 8. This decorative brooch, which has been lovingly framed in gold, is the way in which Lindsay connects Mrs. Appleyard with the darkness and pain of her emotional past. She has lost her beloved husband Arthur, and in carrying the cameo on a gently heaving bosom, she also carries the pain of loss close to her heart. The reference to Kensington, a wealthy district in the West End of London, reinforces her past and her foreignness to Australia. Notice too that all of this takes place on St. Valentine's Day, a date on which romantic relationships are celebrated, and one which reminds Mrs. Appleyard, in a particularly painful way, of her personal loss. At the start of Chapter 4, we are told that Mrs. Appleyard has been dreaming, quote, as she often did, of her late husband, unquote. On page 45, the passage continues. This time, they were walking along the pier at Bournemouth, where a number of pleasure craft and fishing boats were tied up. "Let us go for a sail, my dear," said Arthur. A 4-poster bed with an old-fashioned box mattress was bobbing about on the waves. "Let us swim for it," said Arthur, and taking her arm, dived into the sea. To her surprise and pleasure, she found herself swimming beautifully, cutting through the water like a fish without using her legs or arms. They had just reached the 4-poster and were climbing on board when the sound of Whitehead running the lawnmower under the window put an end to the delightful dream. How Arthur would have revelled in the respectable luxuries of life at Appleyard Cottage. He had always, she remembered complacently, called her his financial genius. Several times in the novel, there are references to Mrs. Appleyard consuming or over-consuming alcohol. On page 229, we are told that, rather remarkably, quote, "A double brandy after breakfast had made her head as clear as a bell," unquote. The details in this brief sentence are telling. A double brandy is a very strong beverage. It was consumed unusually after breakfast, meaning also in private. And the fact that it made her head as clear as a bell is an ironic suggestion that Mrs. Appleyard thought she was thinking clearly, but the alcohol was in fact deceiving her in this regard. Ultimately, Mrs. Appleyard's demise and suicide confirm her anti-hero status, occurring as they do at the very rock whose brooding supernatural presence and appetite for lives consumes even such a powerful figure as this forbidding headmistress. Lastly, let's look at the question of the villain in Picnic at Hanging Rock. Villains play a central role in Gothic literature, often because of their power to corrupt or to subvert the natural order. If we believe that the central problem of the novel is the disappearance of the girls, then the villain must be whoever causes this. Clearly, the novel insinuates that the mysterious rock is in some strange way responsible. It is certainly a powerful force, and by taking the girls to itself, sets in motion that ripple effect of which Joan Lindsay was so conscious when writing the novel. And, as we have acknowledged, it's possible to regard the rock as a character in this text. If we were looking for a human villain, then the closest would be Mrs. Appleyard, who also holds the status of an anti-hero. She is the one who sends the girls and the two tutors off on their picnic. She is the one who reigns over a malevolent kingdom at Appleyard College. She is, of all the Eurocentric characters, the most emblematic of the post-colonial attitude to the land and its incongruities and aberrations. One additional reason we might have for believing in the villainy of Mrs. Appleyard is her treatment of Sarah Wayborn. Notice, by the way, that Sarah's surname is aptonymic, in that it links with her status as an orphan, having been born under wayward circumstances. In the best Gothic traditions, this much maligned girl is placed in solitary confinement in the tower and even tied with leather straps to a rack in the gymnasium. Mrs. Appleyard bullies and persecutes Sarah, obsesses over her unpaid fees, and may even have murdered her, although Lindsay leaves this detail deliberately and tantalizingly ambiguous. Still, whatever the cause of the girl's death, Mrs. Appleyard's sadistic and persecutorial behaviour towards her remains beyond doubt. So, in the end, we have several choices, either to settle for one or the other, or to see both as operating, each in their own way. Joan Lindsay's novel has become a classic of Australian literature, and is now widely recognised internationally as well. It has been lauded as a defining example of Australian post-colonial Gothic fiction, inspiring a film version and a miniseries, and influencing later works such as Sofia Coppola's films The Virgin Suicides and Marie Antoinette, as well as Damon Lindelof's television show The Leftovers. The copy that I am holding of Picnic at Hanging Rock is a rare and valuable 1967 first edition from my personal library. Since its publication, and in recognition of its enduring literary impact, the book's monetary value has increased over 2,000%. I hope that these episodes on various aspects of the novel have helped you to understand why.